I'd like to introduce our guests to kick off our discussion. First up, can I invite Andrew Caruana Galizia, the head of Europe and Eurasia and the member of the Executive Committee for the World Economic Forum. And next we have Dr. Henry Huayo Wang, the founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization. Humberto Lopez is the World Bank Country Director for Turkey. And can I please introduce Dr. Jan Bohannes, a Senior Counsel Advisory Center at the WTO Law. Jane Kelsey is Professor Emeritus of Law at the University of Auckland. And finally, we have Rashid S. Kaukab, Professor, International Institute in Geneva, and Senior Specialist at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And a big welcome to you all. Now, I understand, Humberto, you do have to leave us at some point and catch a flight. So I might pose the first question to you, if I may. I mean, we heard just an excellent presentation there from the Turkish finance minister, essentially painting us a very different picture of what global trade is like in the current environment with various trade conflicts. Can I ask, from a development perspective, how are shifts in global supply chains and investment patterns affecting emerging economies like Turkey and others across the global south?
Thank you. Thank you, Oscar, and thank you to TRT for having all of us here. No? I would like to give you a clear answer, and I will not be able to do it, and this is for several reasons. One is that different countries have different structures, and the impact of any trade tension is going to be different. It's not the same if you're like Turkey, and Minister Simsek was presented that in its presentation, that you trade mainly with the EU and do not trade a lot with countries that have been rising tariffs, than if you are a country that is mainly exporting to a country that you have to suffer an increase in tariffs. A second reason related to that is that trade flows are quite tricky. No? It's not only the fact that you may be affected by tariffs, but what is important is also how your peers and competitors are going to be affected. If the United States is increasing tariffs to Turkey from 10 to 15%, but it's also increasing tariffs to many Asian countries that are peers competitors by a much larger amount, clearly you are going to be in a situation where the negative impact of the first measure can be offset because of the redirection of trade that is going to take place related to that. There is also a third effect, which is uncertainty. You talk to some folks in the private sector, and what you hear is that a 10% tariff or a 15% tariff is not making a big difference at the end. But the uncertainty of not knowing what is happening next year, this is a hit. And it's difficult to make investments in this uncertainty. I was also thinking of the chart that we saw before that the minister was presenting on the global uncertainty that we are experiencing. So when you have all these elements in place together, it's going to be difficult to come with a single message that applies to all the countries in a similar fashion. Now, for Turkey, at the World Bank, we have been looking at what could be the impact with the information that we have today. And again, things change by the day. This week, we know that the United States reached agreements with South Korea, Malaysia, etc. And clearly, the things are very fluid at this moment. But in the case of Turkey, what we are observing is that there would be a negative impact of the increase in tariffs, but this impact is going to be very modest. And it's being very modest because of the limited magnitude of the exports to the United States. More or less 6% of the exports of Turkey go to the United States, but also because there will be, as I was saying, trade redirection from Asia that was going to the United States. It will come to Turkey. So on Turkey, we are in a good place. No? Now, we cannot say the same about all emerging countries, all developing countries, for several reasons. On top of differences by other countries, official development assistance, that is aid coming from traditional donors towards developing economies, is falling very fast. In part of the problem is also, we saw in the previous presentation, is that defense spending is increasing dramatically, and this is eating part of the budgets of overseas developing official development assistance. But on top of that, what we are observing is that in many emerging economies, the levels of debt are extremely high, and the potential of a global slowdown in growth, this could put some countries in a difficult position. So again, hedging a lot on what I'm saying, but I would like to just finish with something positive. And in April this year, in the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, we were quite nervous of the situation, what is going to happen. Just last week, we had the annual meetings, and we have to recognize that the world has been quite resilient no matter what. Last year, growth in emerging markets was around 4.2%. This year, 2025, we're expecting that growth in emerging markets will be around 4%. So it has not, all the concerns that we had have not materialized. What this shows is that the world is quite resilient, that there are risks, but that we have found the ability, or we have observed an ability of the private sector in many of the emerging countries to adjust to the new situation.
Okay, so reason to remain optimistic. Andrew, we know geopolitical tensions are reshaping global trade. How do you see the balance shifting between cooperation and competition? And can global platforms like the World Economic Forum still build trust across divided blocs amid these tensions?
Thank you, Oscar, and huge thanks to TRT World for putting this together. The short answer is yes, we can try, and we do every day. I think it's important to set the context a little bit. So we often say when it comes to climate change that the politics have changed, but the science has not. When it comes to global cooperation, it's the same. The geopolitics have changed, but the need to cooperate has not gone away. Global challenges have not gone away. And if you look at our global risks report that we publish each year, the short-run risks might change slightly year to year, but the long-run risks are always the same, and they're climate and nature related, and also sometimes public health related. And none of those problems remain within national borders. And so a deep worry, I think, for many of us, and something that keeps us working around the clock, is that that connective tissue that's required to resolve those kinds of problems, especially when a crisis crops up, like a new pandemic or a national disaster, for example, we're losing that connective tissue that allows us to help each other, to take preventive action. And so what can an organization like ours do in this context? I would say we can work more at two levels. The first one is to look for issues where cooperation at a global level is still possible. So on questions like technology governance, so AI governance, I think we can all agree, and even China and the US agreed, that we shouldn't use AI to manage nuclear weapons, for example. So that's a sort of minimum starting point. Hopefully that that spirit of cooperation can be taken further back into areas like global public health, the protection of nature, as well as more ambitious climate targets. So that's at the global level, including all stakeholders. A second level at which we can play a part is on smaller groupings of countries on more areas of cooperation. So what some people call minilateralism. We're doing that in Europe to an extent related to competitiveness questions. We're doing it also on very specific sectors. On, for example, batteries, or trying to set the rules at a private sector level on artificial intelligence. So there are different formations on which we can make progress and continue to build trust that don't necessarily have to take place at the head of state level of the key economies globally. We can also make progress working with the private sector, with civil society, and a few governments who are willing to still to cooperate. And the important thing is that those systems remain in place, that we maintain a minimum level of trust, so that when the geopolitical cycle shifts, as I hope it will turn, we will not have to start from scratch. And ultimately, if we take the very humble goal of ensuring that the world survives with as little collateral damage as possible through the current period of transition, the current era of monsters, then hopefully we'll have more than a little left to build on in future. And so in terms of our own organizational strategy, we simply have to move back to what we were created to do more than 50 years ago, which is to serve as a neutral platform for dialogue for people who don't necessarily want to speak to each other. Sometimes don't want to speak to each other in even informal contexts, but who still have a responsibility to their own citizens, to citizens in neighboring countries, to people across the world, to continue to manage challenges that spread across borders.
Thank you. Dr. Wang, we saw some of the trust being rebuilt on that highly anticipated meeting between the US and Chinese presidents a couple of days ago. Can you tell us more about how China is responding to the US de-risking and its decoupling efforts? And do you see this leading to parallel economic systems or even a new form of interdependence?
Great. Thank you, Margaret. And so I think this TRT forum is really a great platform. So thank the organizers for inviting me. I think that what has happened last Thursday that concluded in Busan, South Korea, between President Xi and President Trump is very significant. Because I think, since Trump's second term, that for the last 8-9 months, for the first time, the two leaders met again. But also, it's actually 6 years they met again. And what I think they have done is they achieved quite remarkable progress, because I think it was really, it all comes down, there's a lot of, this second term of Trump. Basically, I found there's a new normal that has been getting into that. I remember Secretary Rubio actually once said in July that China and the US should seek strategic stability. I remember first term they proposed China and US, it's a strategic rivalry, but now you're talking about strategic stability. So I think that is the right term. So I think the style of the second term, the so-called new normal, is that they're starting to engage a lot of discussions, from Geneva to Stockholm to Madrid to London to Kuala Lumpur. 5 rounds of talks between Secretary Scott Bensing and Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng. So they actually set a framework, set a very good progress. So I think this, what happened in the last few days is that this time they will come down. The US has lowered 10% for the fentanyl taxes. And of course also they have stopped, put on hold, the port fees and the administrative fees charged for all the ships from China. And then also they have put on hold 24% on some other taxes. And also further, there's the entity penetration rules that, for example, there's 1,300 Chinese company was on the entity list. This penetration rule would also attack its subsidiaries, which can be thousands, tens of thousands of Chinese companies. So the U.S. has put that on hold now. So China, I think in return has actually agreed to buy more soybeans, which helped Trump enormously for his base in the rural area. And also China going to put on hold also 1 year of this rare earths, which is dual-use product that administrative measures put on hold for a year as well. I think U.S. is also going to relax some chips on that. So furthermore, I think they agreed there was a high-level meetings. President Trump is going to come to Beijing next April, and President Xi is going to Washington probably next fall. So I think now they have reached some kind of a stability, I would say, because that would be basically for the next 3 years where Trump is still in office. As President Trump said on Air Force One, this meeting, 1 out of 10, he gave 12. It's the highest mark he can give. So I would think, after all those 8 months of second term of Trump, after first 4 years of Trump, 4 years of Biden, U.S. and China finally realized that we cannot really separate from each other. If we really do that, we're going to hurt each other. As President Xi rightly said at the summit, let's get off this vicious cycle of retaliation of each other, right? And also President Trump's MAGA and Chinese rejuvenation of the nation, that two objectives doesn't really conflict. They can really work together. But I think also it's created enormous, for the world to watch is the stability, because all the countries doesn't want to pick sides. They really want to see the world, more predictable. So I think just now the Minister of Economic Finance of Turkey said rightly so. I think China is rising very fast. Manufacturing, for example, is 35% now and could be 40, 50%. So I think the world probably getting used to that. Why we get used to the U.S. dominate for so many years, and they're not really getting used to China rising a bit fast, right? China now has the basically world lead power on the green power. 2/3 of renewable energy come out of China. If you talk about speed railways, 70% of global speedway is in China. And China have 5 million 5G stations. US and Europe probably have 500,000 each. So enormously, and then 2/3 of renewable energy coming also out of China, and China every year produce 12, 13 million college graduates, half of them STEM related. So I think that kind of synergy, that kind of compounding, synchronizing power is going to really carry China to be more efficient and more competitive. But what about other, people talk about, China products flood, or there is a lot of oversupply and issues like that. But China is actually interested to really manufacturing and investing overseas. China, I just came back from Brazil, that China invested a big factory, BYD, a big factory in Brazil. President Lula opened that. China also invested, BYD also invested another big manufacturing of EVs in Turkey. President, the minister just said they're going to jump up on the green energy production. I think China can help on that. China going to invest also in Europe. I was also suggesting that a lot of European companies are in China. Why can't we JV back BMW, Mercedes, Volkswagen? They can coming back to invest in Europe. China already invested in Hungary, in Spain, in many other countries. So I think the solution for that is really Chinese company can invest massively back into those countries, including the United States. So that would be really helping, solve these trade frictions, products, if there's manufacturing in the world, and helping local employment revenues. I think that's probably a good solution. So in a nutshell, I think, the world probably, the US now is getting used to China rising. No longer talk about regime change, no longer talk about let's have a different system or have to have the same system. Like the US, the government official said, if the two countries are so different, but it's so big and so impactful, we might as well have to coexist, has to get along, and then we have to seek strategic stability. I think that's using Rubio's word. So I think in that sense, if China and US get along, that would be a great blessing for the world and for all the countries. So all the tensions are really out of this big power competition, and we have to really stop that. We have to really be a friendly Olympic-style competition rather than this kind of strategic rivalry standpoint. So I think in that sense, China's rise, and China recently just announced a new 5-year plan. It's going to be a blessing for the world. And the China Belt and Road Initiative has invested over $1 trillion in the last decade, creating 3,000 projects worldwide. So I'm sure that with all those corridors the minister mentioned, Belt and Road Corridor can also help, and we can really all work together with the World Bank, with everybody, and Davos. And so Turkey is playing a big role in building. I was quite impressed with the Istanbul airport, so big now. So we can see more roles to be played by emerging global South countries.
And that détente that President Xi and Trump had agreed on will last for a year. So let's see what happens in that time and also after that agreement ends. Dr. Bahanas, can I ask you now, we know the World Trade Organization has been the key arbiter of trade disputes between countries so far, but even before the current climate, it had been under immense strain, especially its dispute settlement mechanism. Can you tell me, how can the rules-based trading system remain credible in a climate where national security is often cited to justify launching trade wars or imposing tariffs?
Well, it's an excellent question. It's one of the defining questions of today, not just for the dispute settlement system, but for the entire body of WTO law as a whole that we've built up over the last 80 years. I'm afraid there are only good questions here and no clear good answers. Let me unpack that a little bit. I mean, Oscar, you asked that question because there's an increasing array of measures that are being taken in terms of trade regulation that are being justified on the basis of national security. And you talk about import restrictions, export restrictions, treating trading partners in a differentiated manner, sanctions. National security is, legally speaking, it's a real thing. It's not invented. It is in the agreements. There are national security clauses both at the WTO level as well as at the regional and bilateral level. And you can use them, technically speaking, to justify measures that may depart from your obligations. So you remain then technically within the bounds of the law. But historically, what's really interesting is that until about 10 years ago, these clauses remained dormant, essentially. Governments exercised a lot of restraint in invoking them, at least explicitly, and in challenging each other about their use. And it's only in the last 10 years that we have seen some adjudication in the WTO number of cases. Now, it's interesting to ask, why is it that governments initially exercised, this restraint? Because national security clauses, by their very nature and by their wording, if you look at their wording, they grant the invoking member a lot of discretion. You can call it discretion, deference, self-judgment, self-assessment. Because national security is really very much a political decision. Now, there are some rules, there are some guardrails in the WTO National Security Clause, and they have been fleshed out a little bit by the case law that we've had in the last 10 years, and it could be effective of corralling that self-assessment a bit. But now, a number of members, and most prominently the United States, are rejecting even these guardrails, and they're saying it should be 100% discretionary, 100% self-assessment. If I want to and need to act in the name of national security, then it's entirely self-judging. Nobody's allowed to question. Now, if you espouse that view, then there's a huge tension there with the notion of rule of law. Because the rule of law really, or a rules-based system, really requires some objective markers so that you can have some certainty and predictability, a conversation about which measures are permissible, which are not, and ultimately also, and that's where the dispute settlement system comes in, to have an independent third party adjudicate a rule on those. If it's entirely subjective, you cannot have all of that. And so if you push the boundaries, if you start equating ever-increasing areas of trade regulation, if you start equating them with the exercise of, security policy, you crowd out the law. You basically slide into a power-based paradigm and into fragmentation with little glue holding these fragments together. So that's the conundrum that we have now with national security. Now, what can we do? I mean, like I said before, there's only good questions and not many good answers. Now, it's obviously for members to decide how to move forward, how to revitalize the multilateral, rules-based multilateral trading system with the WTO as its center, which I fervently believe in. What can we do? Well, you could consider going back to that equilibrium, to that restraint, where you exercise a self-restraint in invoking national security to the only most extreme situations. That would take a lot of trust, that would take a lot of, recalibrating the current climate. Now, we know it can be done, but not clear how realistic it is in this climate. We could change the law. We could really go open up the agreements and amend them, but again, it requires consensus of all members, and in fact, members disagree on the idea that national security should be entirely 100% self-assessed based and self-judging. Most members do not agree with this. There is a proposal that I wanted to mention that the United States has actually put forward, and that's been discussed in literature as well, most notably by former Deputy Director General of the WTO, Mr. Alan Wolf, who writes extremely well in case you're interested reading him. And it's based on the idea of managed retaliation, as it were. So the United States has proposed, and I'm not clear at all how acceptable that would be to other members, to say we will not adjudicate the right or wrong, the legality or illegality of national security invocation. But if a member invokes national security, we would then say, okay, you are, say, imposing import duties. That way you are impairing the economic benefits of an exporting country. Well, they have the right then also to take countermeasures. And if there's a disagreement about the amount on which the other government can take retaliatory measures, then the WTO could arbitrate that. So it's, you give up on the adjudication, but you have sort of this controlled, adjudicated retaliation process, so you don't get into the spiral of retaliation that Dr. Wang was referring to. Now, not clear at all how acceptable that would be to other members, whether on its own or as part of a overall reform package. But what hopefully should remain, and the goal of this entire exercise would be to reestablish, revitalize the rules-based multilateral system with the WTO in its center. But like I said, unfortunately, only good questions here and not clear and good answers.
Professor Kelsey, you've long argued that global trade rules often favor the powerful. How is the return of protectionism and economic nationalism reshaping that imbalance, do you think?
Reshaping's a really interesting concept, and it made me think back to some of the comments yesterday about the importance of a historical context to understand where we are today, because the global trade policy and the exercise by states of global governance has historically been a matter of power politics. There's been constant reshaping that has occurred over time for strategic, for political, for economic reasons. So ranging through from the era of colonization through to the post-World War II disposition to decolonization and the introduction of bilateral investment treaties to protect foreign investors, through to the Uruguay round of the GATT in the mid-1980s to mid-1990s. And in each case, we have had powerful states that have reshaped the global agenda and rules in their own interests and the interests of their capital. And the system we're in now is, of course, the one that was generated in the Uruguay round during the period that some of us refer to as the neoliberal era, where we became much more focused in the international trade rules with notions of market efficiency, and the assumption of market efficiency is that you have a kind of level playing field, but you don't have a level playing field. And the question then is, who are the beneficiaries of those rules? Now, I happened to start to be involved in this in 1990, in the middle of the Uruguay round, when we became aware that trade rules had been expanded to include intellectual property rights, the regulation of services, along with exceptionalism for the US in areas like agriculture, but also for the EU in agriculture. And so the foundations of what is today called the rules-based system was in fact very much a construct of the power politics of that time. And some of us at that time were skeptical about how long that would in fact last before those contradictions started to emerge. And as we saw with what some call the hyperglobalization period, that intensified those contradictions. So the minister talked before, quoting Antonio Gramsci, you know, the old is dying, the new is yet to be born. We are in an interregnum. The interregnum has many morbid symptoms. And if we think over the last 10 to 15, even 20 years of the current multilateral rules-based system, there have been morbid symptoms that have emerged time after time. Collapsed negotiating rounds, financial crises, issues in the paralysis of the WTO and the development of plurilateral and mega-regional agreements, many of which themselves got paralyzed, the US-EU, the Trade and Services Agreement, closure, down, withdrawal from bilateral investment treaties from many. And so what worries me in a lot of the current discourse is that people are focusing on Trump and not actually looking at the factors that underpin the Trump phenomenon. And not just Trump, Brexit. A number of the protests that have occurred in developed countries that are jobs related, that are economics related, but also over COVID and the monopolies over pharmaceuticals, or the financial crises and the way that various players got bailed out in those crises and who paid the price. The resource exploitation that we're seeing at present in the name of green energies. And so there is a real concern that the focus around Trump and so-called protectionism is not asking the core questions about why are we having this backlash? What are the morbid symptoms that are in fact driving the problems in the system? And the minister said, and it was said yesterday as well, that we have to look at what the solutions are. And at present, we seem to have three solutions on the table. One is Trump's approach. And Trump's approach, in addition to what people have identified here, a reference was made, for example, to the recent agreements that the US has reached, say, with Malaysia. And I invite people to read that because it has gone full circle back to turning Malaysia into a colonial vassal of the US. We have a quite exceptional set of obligations, and this is a template for what the US is going to be demanding of others. It's the first really good look I think we've had of what this might involve, which raises questions about this new détente with China. Because very briefly, there are three key factors. One is the US has gone for its unfinished business in what it's wanted in trade rules and not been able to get. And that includes billions of dollars of procurement commitments by Malaysia, which will come out of its domestic budget. Secondly, there is the targeting of China. Chinese investments in Malaysia, state-owned enterprise activities, and in particular digital relationships between Malaysia and China's access to data. And thirdly, and this is the most shocking, that Malaysia is required basically to emulate US measures that are adopted for US economic and national security reasons, and US measures to address unfair practices by third countries. Now, this is an agreement that has been signed without any democratic process, but which is going to require Malaysia to pass legislation and accept this. Now, my assumption is that there is going to be a huge backlash in Malaysia and in other countries that are going to be adopting similar kinds of agreements. So that's one solution on the table. Second solution, very briefly, is try to rescue the existing system without asking what the problems are with it. And my government and other governments are doing all sorts of little multi-deals to try to have a demonstration effect that everyone still supports the system. It's not going to make any difference, but it's not going to address the problems. And the third option that's on the table is talk about this development of a multipolar approach. The multipolar approach relying in particular on the BRICS, but the BRICS themselves in the WTO certainly are not united. They're in very different places. Some of them are supporting so-called reform by doing of the WTO, ignoring the rules in the WTO to make changes. Others are trying to stabilize some development dimension in the WTO, but they're all after their own political interests. They're not after the least developed countries' interests, small island developing states' interests and others. And they're not after the social impacts that this model is having. So, I'm much more pessimistic about where we end up here. The President and the Vice President yesterday called for a new approach, a new model at which justice was at the core. I see no justice at the core in any of the dialogue that's happening or the solutions happening at present. So our challenge is, if we actually want to have a fair and just global trading regime, to start having a dialogue about that.
Rashid, I think that brings us to you, because as trade becomes more fragmented and security-driven, as we've been hearing, how can we keep the issue of sustainability and development goals at the center of global trade policy? Because we're currently in a climate when it seems that those issues are on the back burner. So how can we put them once more at the forefront, or at least as key considerations?
Thank you very much, Oscar. Let me start. I have been in this global trading debates, part of that for the last 30 years, which one can call, in the modern history of trade, the so-called golden period of global trading system. But during that time, and it has been a lot coming from a developing country myself, working for NGOs, and sometimes working with Jane. So yes, passion for development, for sustainable development, bringing that to the global trade agenda. That has been the effort of the last 30 years of my life. But were we able to put it at the center of the global trade agenda? No. That was not easy, and that was not and could not be completely concretized. So very important point to keep in mind. A lot of effort, which definitely made some difference. And then what happened was, of course, a lot of rhetoric, which I think in itself an achievement that people talk about that. In the trade circles also, in agreement negotiations, you hear the word development, interests of developing countries, interests of the poor, environmental interests, climate change. But concretizing them into binding obligations, very, very difficult. And the reason, somehow the trade policy makers and trade negotiators have a very mercantilistic mindset. So converting these rhetoric, why everybody agreed, yes, we need development. We need to promote that. We need to protect environment. We need to deal with climate change. But then how to do that? And that is the craft of trade policy and trade agreements. How to reconcile that with this dollar cent negotiations, how to put them at the same level, synchronize them, that has been very difficult exercise. Of course, now we are in this present moment of a great shock. A lot is happening, this uncertainty index that the minister also showed. So in that, what should we be doing? And the people who care about development, who care about sustainable development. So my first response would be, we have to keep talking about that. The first minimum, if Trump and others are not talking about it, it does not mean we stop talking about that as well. So keep asking, keep demanding, keep mentioning, keep forcing the argument. That is absolutely the minimum thing that we must be doing. Practically, we are hearing a lot of interest. People, countries are reaching out to partners across the border, in the region, sub-region, across the world, to cut deals, to find alternatives, to build relationships. In that, when doing that, we have to and we must try to keep development and sustainable development part of that concrete relationship building. We can do that. It can be with our next door neighbor through a bilateral arrangement. It can be with the other countries in the sub-region, or across the region, or even across the world. But when Mercosur and AFCFTA, for example, if they talk to each other, they are from the developing world. They should keep the development and see how they can address climate change also, try to figure out, experiment with those rules. And then, thirdly, national level action. In many developing countries, and I have been working in a lot of developing countries, the trade policy actually has been a top-down affair. An international agreement is signed in Geneva or elsewhere, and national trade policy follows that. And I had often wondered and argued it should be a reverse, a bottoms-up approach. See what kind of trade policy suits your country based on your development objectives. Who should benefit from your trade policy? Which sectors should government be supporting? Should it be based on vested interests? Should it be based on lobbying, or should it be based on the socio-economic environmental indicators of that sector? Should we be, while promoting exports, should not we be thinking of and looking at the domestic trade? I'm not going to name any countries, but I have seen these examples, and I'm sure many of us would have seen. In one developing country, in one part of the country, something is in short supply. And that same thing is being produced in another part of the same country, but not flowing to the rest of the country. So should not the domestic trade policy be dealing with that? So in all of that, what I'm saying is, yes, there's a great shock. It's a very uncertain, sometimes scary world. But within shocks are also opportunities. Shock is a time when we have the possibility, if we know what we want, and if we are committed to doing that, to also think of how to build it, how to use this opportunity to work to achieve our goals. And in this case, this is sustainable development. And Oscar, since I think I'm the last speaker after these 2 wonderful days at this forum, which I'm very grateful to be here, let me take that advantage of being the last speaker and being probably one of the oldest persons around, that, yes, I mean, I don't think I heard in this panel the dirty word tariff. So of course, everybody's talking about tariffs. And I get it. In my long life, I have not seen what is happening now, this indiscriminate, frequent, and I would call whimsical use of tariffs. Lot of smoke and lot of uncertainty, lot of challenges there. But the last 30 years, which is as I was saying, the golden age of the modern avatar of the global trading system, we have seen a number of crises. I mean, the minister showed some of them in his graph. I was putting a graph, and I had counted 5 or 6. So which is like every 5-6 years, there is a crisis. Of course, I'm not belittling the importance, the shock of what is happening. But we live in a world of crisis, and the severity of those crises that the global trading system faces keeps increasing. So in that, yes, we have to do and should try to do something, but also we should keep our sanity, and what is really important, do not forget what do we really believe in. What is it that we really want, and how can we convert these shocks and crises into opportunities? And let me end at one of my favorite verses, and I want to end on an optimistic note. If I don't do that, at my age, I'm going to die. So for my own sakes, not just for others. So this verse goes something like, 2 men gazed through prison bars. One saw mud, the other saw stars. So yes, there's a lot of mud, but let's try to look at the stars also. They will certainly shine. Thank you.
What a great note. A bit of optimism, much needed in the current environment. I actually have been told we do have a few more minutes left. Umberto, do you have to leave at this point? 5 minutes, okay. Can I ask just this next question to you? Rashid has spoken about the need for optimism at this point in time. You get the sense from a lot of other more pessimistic observers that under the current climate, especially with particular administrations in power, that things are perhaps going to get worse before they get better. What's your assessment of the current climate? Even, despite the upheaval that we're seeing in global trade rules, trade conflicts, is there reason to feel optimistic at this point?
I'm an optimistic. I couldn't do my job if I didn't believe that we are going to be improving. What is important is, apart from what we want to believe, is to start focusing on what we need to do for things to materialize. And when I was talking before, and I was referring to the challenges that we are observing in many countries, I think that what is important is that we all think how at each country level we are going to reduce policy uncertainty, which is a big issue, and this is a combination of external factors but also domestic factors, how we are going to put the fiscal house in order in many emerging countries that clearly after the COVID shock, after the current situation, they are in a difficult situation, but recognizing that this need to be brought back to situation under control, this is extremely important. In the World Bank, we are increasing now dramatically also our lending. We are lending now at a rate of $100 billion per year, and what we are focusing, really laser focus, is in the creation of jobs. It's estimated that over the next 25 years, 1 billion people will enter the job market, creating jobs for everybody so that it doesn't create any type of social tension in the countries is going to be critical. And yet, I continue being optimistic that if we talk, if we put all our brains together to move forward, this is going to happen.
Okay, Andrew, this next one's for you. Your organization hosts a famous summit in the ski resort town of Davos every January. We know, I expect the current trade climate will be at least on the agenda. Can you give us an inside scoop? Will you be extending an invitation to the US president to attend?
I've already been scooped by the Swiss media. They've already announced that he's planning to come.
Donald Trump will
but
come
it's
to
not,
Davos. Okay.
you know, we're very far away from January and many things can change. But we always invite the US president, just as we invite the Chinese president, the Turkish president. We have no value unless we're a universal platform. We make some exceptions from time to time if we feel that it might hurt the broader conversation. But the value in what we do is that we're an impartial platform. It's often tempting for us to pick sides. We're made up of human beings and we have our own views. But the world needs a few organizations which remain neutral, impartial, even when there are forces pulling them in many different directions. and we'll continue to do that. That's our mandate.
And on the topic of an optimistic outlook, do you share that mood for optimism in this current climate?
No, I'm realistic. So I try not to swing, you know, from optimism to pessimism. But I do believe in long-term plodding progress. I know how easily a single action can wipe out, you know, many decades of progress. And if we're too optimistic, that can be a heavy blow. But I see certain forces which are, you know, so to contextualize things, you know, there's so much hype around artificial intelligence, how it's going to make our lives so much better or make our lives so much worse. But when you look at what could really change the future of humanity, often that power still lies with politicians. So that power is still within human hands. It doesn't sit within a machine. And so that's positive and negative. You know, a single world leader can set us back decades on climate change, for example, or on peace and conflict. But that is cause for optimism because we still have agency. What the current leaders of the world's largest economies have taught us is that great leaders, defined as powerful leaders, can really change the course of history. It's a reminder that we haven't had in many, many years. Yeah. And that should be cause for belief that the future is in our hands, essentially.
So some realism and optimism there. Dr. Wang, we know that the meeting between the US and Chinese presidents gave markets, but also observers some reason to be optimistic, at least in the short term. They announced a scaling back of the retaliatory tariffs against each other's economies. What is your outlook, say, in the next 2 to 4 years? Yeah. Do you think things will improve, or are they likely to get worse before they get better?
Well, I certainly think that things will get improved. I agree with what just said. You know, great leaders has really made things happen. But you remember, basically, this is what happened for the last 8 years since Trump started the trade war. So these days, basically, if we have, you know, military war, maybe it's already, you know, it's mutually assured destruction. So the deterrence level is so high now between those major players. So it's very unlikely we're going to break out a major military war. I would just say that. So the war is fought on the economic front, on the trade front, on the green development front. And then obviously you can see the winners, right? So, so I think, you know, now we have to get used to this new normal basically is that we have to, through this peaceful competition, you know, let's compete performance. You know, lift 800 million people out of poverty, become the largest green power producer in the world. You know, so the new war, the new future development will be fought in green development, sustainable development, leaving poverty, you know, get rid of, you know, those debt and global debt and things like that. So that's why you see BRICS really getting attraction, global South get attraction because China is there, and because the people see the economic circle is better than the military and security one, because the economic prosperity is the biggest benefit. If we violate that, that's the biggest risk. You talk about security, economic prosperity is the biggest security we should have. That's what happened in the last 80 years. So I think what has happened now, I'm giving very high credit for this summit just concluded a few days ago, is that it's really ushering a new era. It's a paradigm shift because it no longer really be a big bully against the others. It has to be equal now. We have to really talk about it. I'm really give credit for this summit that both sides come to the rational sense, and then through, you know, rounds of dialogues, and now they come to some kind of compromise, and that pattern should be continued. Otherwise, what can you do? You cannot. You fight and both fight. Let's get rid of this kind of vicious cycle of retaliations. It's no good for both countries. US feel the pain as well. I mean, so it's not just China feel the pain. So now it's better that everybody come back to the normality, and we have to live peacefully, coexist, and then find a way to get along, and also build a new global multipolar system that reform UN and do those things, Security Councils, and then that process is going to take quite a long time. But in the meantime, I think we reach a new equilibrium, and that equilibrium with this strategic deterrence will be stayed for some time.
Okay, and on that note, we'll wrap our discussion. I'm sure we could talk for much longer, but can we please thank our guests, Andrew Caruana Galizia, Dr. Henry Huayo Wang, Humberto Lopez, Dr. Jan Bohannes, Professor Jane Kelsey, and Rashid S. Kaub.